When you think about the history of India, what comes to mind? Probably magnificent forts, right? Powerful emperors, grand kingdoms. It's this epic story of dynasties, sultans, and Mughals. But that's not the whole story. Not even close. There's this entire other history running right alongside it, and that's what we're going to dive into. So on one hand, you've got the kingdoms. Think of a very structured society, right? It was strictly divided by the rules of Varna, which created this clear hierarchy, rich and poor, all set by the Brahmanas. But then, on the other hand, you have the tribes. And their world, it was completely different. We're talking about societies united by family ties, with no huge gaps between people. And they lived by their own customs, their own rules. And that contrast, it just begs the question, right? What if that familiar story of kings and empires we all learn about, what if that's only half the story? Okay, to really get into that, we first have to understand what these other societies were all about. So let's start by decoding what makes a tribe a tribe. What made their way of life so different? All right, let's get right down to it. What exactly is a tribe? Well, there are a few key features that really define them. First off, kinship was everything. Family bonds were the glue that held everyone together. Second, their whole livelihood came from what they could farm, hunt, or herd. And here's a big one. Resources like land and pastures weren't owned by individuals. Nope, they were controlled jointly by the whole group. And all the while, they kept their own separate, unique cultures alive. And check this out. Images like this really bring that world to life, don't they? Here you can see members of the Bhil tribe from western and central India out hunting deer at night. It's just such a powerful snapshot of a life that was completely intertwined with the forest and the land. So how were they organized? Well, the core building block for many of these tribes was something called a clan. And a clan is basically just a group of families who all believe they come from the same common ancestor. So your loyalty, it wasn't to some distant king, it was to your family, to your clan. That was the absolute foundation of their world. All right, so we've got a handle on what a tribe is. Now let's see just how widespread they were. We're going to take a quick trip across the subcontinent and literally map out where all these different groups called home. And wow, just look at this map. It really shows you the sheer scale of what we're talking about. Tribal people weren't just stuck in one little corner of India. They were everywhere. In almost every single region, you've got tribes in the northern mountains, all the way down to the southern highlands, and from the west coast to the east. So let's start our tour up in the north, in Punjab. You had tribes like the Khokars, who were super powerful back in the 13th and 14th centuries. And then came the Ghakkars. They became so influential that their chief was actually made a noble, a Mansabdor, in the Mughal Emperor Akbar's court. That's a big deal. Now, let's swing over to the northeast. This whole part of the subcontinent was pretty much dominated by tribes. We're talking about groups like the Nagas, the Homs, and so many others. They were the ones shaping the history and culture of that entire region. Okay, now let's head to central India. Here, you had these massive tribes, like the Bhils and the Gonds, and they were spread across enormous territories. Think about it. Areas that today cover parts of Chhattisgarh, Madhya Pradesh, Maharashtra, and Andhra Pradesh. They weren't just present, they were a major force. And you see this pattern again and again, all across the map. You have the Kolis out west, the Mundas and Santals in the east. The takeaway here is simple. Pretty much wherever you looked on the subcontinent, you would find these vibrant, distinct tribal societies living their own way. But wait, the tribes weren't the only ones living outside the box of the settled kingdoms. There's another whole parallel world to explore, and this one was constantly on the move. Let's talk about the nomads and traders. So, who were these people? Well, many were nomadic pastoralists. That means they were always moving, covering long distances with their herds of animals. They lived off milk, wool, ghee, all the stuff their animals provided. But they were also incredibly important for the economy. See, they'd trade all those pastoral products with settled farmers for stuff they couldn't make, like grain or cloth. They were the essential connectors, the link between all these different communities. And when you talk about trade on the move, there's one group that stands out above all the rest, the Banjaras. These guys were, without a doubt, the most important trader nomads around. Just to give you a sense of their scale, get this. During a single military campaign, the Banjaras could transport food grain for the massive Mughal army using 100,000 bullocks. 100,000! That is an absolutely mind-boggling logistical operation. And we even have eyewitness accounts. There was this English trader in the 17th century, Peter Mundy, and he wrote about seeing a Banjara caravan, what they called a tanda. He said, "In the morning, we met a tanda of Banjaras with 14,000 oxen. They were all laden with grains, such as wheat and rice." Can you even imagine seeing that? He basically described it as a moving city of people, animals, and goods. And this picture kind of gives you a feel for it, right? You can see these mobile traders with their camels, getting ready to move goods. These caravans were like the lifeblood of the economy, the arteries of commerce that connected every corner of India, and even linked the subcontinent to the world beyond. Okay, so we've got these three distinct worlds: the settled kingdoms, the tribes in the hills and forests, and the nomads constantly on the move. So what happened when they actually ran into each other? Let's dig into how these different worlds collided and connected. Right. The first thing you have to understand is that these worlds were not separate. They weren't isolated at all. They were constantly interacting, trading with each other, depending on each other, and yeah, sometimes fighting each other. And that made for a really complex relationship. It was a mix of conflict, for sure, but also dependence. You know, a kingdom might clash with a tribe over land, but at the same time, that kingdom needed the tribe for things like forest products or for their skills as transporters. It really was a two-way street. So here's the bottom line. All this interaction, this constant push and pull, this back and forth, it wasn't just stuff happening. It was a powerful engine for change. Over time, it slowly but surely changed both the tribal societies and the settled kingdoms. And that leaves us with one last big thought. You know, history is almost always written by the powerful, right? By the people in the grand courts of the settled kingdoms. But as we've just seen, that's only one side of the coin. It makes you wonder, doesn't it? What other stories, what other hidden histories are just waiting to be discovered in those spaces in between?